I think people can perceive the violence in their economic realities. And I think this is where the thesis of peace actually invites a new psychological state, as well as, I think, language of freedom. And I think the freedom not just of economic choice, which I think is usually a freedom to escape the tyranny of the system, but a freedom to be radically human, which is to construct a system that ennobles us in a different way.
Today, I'm pleased to be joined by architect and mission steward of Dark Matter Labs, Indy Johar. Indy is also the co-founder of the architecture and urban practice Architecture 00, a founding director of Open System Labs, and a non-executive international director of the Blocks Hub, the Nordic hub for sustainable urbanization. Indy has taught and lectured at various institutions, including Harvard, MIT, and the New School, and is currently a professor at RMIT University. Today, Indy and I have a very wide boundary conversation about how the structure and design of our physical systems in our culture shape our values and behaviors, and how they in turn shape the system back. We also dive into some emergent projects and ideas, what he calls fissures, that may be key to leading us towards better human and planetary systems. Perhaps this conversation can plant the seeds of change in viewers like yourself to create your own movements wherever you are towards more pro-social futures. This was a conversation that unexpectedly was both interesting and inspiring to me, and I hope it will be the same for you. Before we begin, if you enjoy this podcast, please share this episode or another episode you love with someone you think would benefit from it, or learn from it. Without further ado, please welcome Indy Johar. Indy Johar, welcome to the program.
Delighted to be here. It's a real pleasure.
I met you a year ago, 2 years ago in Austin at an Emerge conference, and this is our first conversation since then, and I'm really been looking forward to it. So let me tee you up. You have a background in architecture, but your work today is really much broader than that and focuses on the social change informed by a wide view systems lens of all the converging global crises we face. Can you start off by describing your journey to the current work that you're doing now at Dark Matter Labs?
I trained as an architect, and I remember the first I wasn't a very good student, being really honest, and it was my third year where one of my professors sort of said, "So, Indy, what's the future of the city?" And it was one of those questions which became kind of almost haunted me for the rest of my life, because in a sense it was a knowledge question that is operating at the intersection of so many issues and challenges. And from there on in, I ended up being, really focused on how do we democratize the making of places. And by democracy, I don't mean the representation of power, but actually the means to construct society. And so I was part of Building 00. We built WikiHouse, open source housing, Open Desk, open source furniture company, all the way to being part of building the Impact Hub network, multiple impact hubs around the world, to building social investment structures. So we kind of experienced the kind of tools of making. But what became very clear was that behind the things that we were trying to make, there were a bunch of strategic institutional logics which were limiting and controlling the nature of the world we were making. And I'll give you a sort of boring practical example, which is like, everyone was talking about how do you build affordable housing. Well, yes, you can make the house by decentralizing the production of the house, but most of the value of a house is in land. And actually, where is the value in land when you start to really ask the question? The value of land is actually a function of the monopolistic access that land provides to critical common goods, i.e. labor markets, cultures, transportation systems, these sort of intangible assets which are common goods typically. and the land provides that access. So the value of a house is not just the material construction of the house, it's the access it provides. And what you started to find was that actually we were privatizing these common goods in the form of property and the kind of boundary. So, and that really opened up the journey into dark matter labs, where we could democratize the means of making, but there was a much deeper structural question about actually what are the institutional infrastructures and what are they reinforcing in the constitution of power. And then when you start to look at theories of property and what they externalize, what they start to drive, and I think this links back into much more of the bigger questions that we're now all talking in the middle of, is theories of property, theories of boundary in an entangled world create the capacity and forcing functions to externalize and extract, and thereby set up the precedents, I think, at the core structural level of the crisis that we're in, which is we're externalizing and extracting at the point that we are not in stewardship of the generation or value that we're operating in. So in a way, my journey has been vertically through the system to that point, and then coming back out into some of the kind of polycrisis issues that you and Daniel and various other people talk about.
And how important is your training as an architect to apply to the meta crisis and the human predicament?
Not necessarily uniquely so, but I think what architecture and design do give you is two things. One is architecture is fundamentally about the fusion of knowledges. It is an intersection of knowledges. It is not a singular practice itself. And secondly, it is a propositional discipline as opposed to an analytical discipline. And I think that's quite a different type of capability. To be able to propose into the world is not the same pathway as to be able to analyze into the world. And I think those two things, and then I think it does, architecture is philosophically and structurally rooted and has a journey of being rooted into different ways of our relationship to the planet, whether it's theories of property or the theories of stewardship, theories of our relationship with the land. These are all rooted in some of the foundational frameworks. So I think architecture as a discipline, certainly for me, has opened up many of these things. And then I would even argue the coding of capital is fundamentally rooted in theories of property. And the coding of capital, as people like Katrina Prestar elegantly talk about, has been so fundamental in the abstraction and externalization that we're witnessing. So I think architecture has played a very dominant role in my understanding of the crisis.
I actually have a ton of questions about what you just said and property and all the things. But one thing that I've noticed in your writings is you often use the phrase, "What we design designs us back." Can you unpack what that means? And then I have a lot of questions about it.
Yeah, I think the phrase is largely a derivative of what people like Churchill said. We make the built environment and the world around us and the buildings around us, and they make us. And I think that's, as a metaphor, also expands beyond the built environment. It expands to theories of contract. It expands to theories of employment law. It expands to, if we reduce ourselves to being contractual, economically incentivized agents, it reduces us to only seeing ourselves as homo economists. So I think we have this reciprocal relationship with the world that we design and the nature of how we interpret and imagine ourselves. I think there's some beautiful examples of even if somebody studies economics, it reduces their comprehension and incentive of how they perceive humanity through a mechanical, very simplistic economist model. It sort of changes their behavior. And there's a lot of research that's starting to point to, and this is something we often talk about now, where CEOs or orchestrators of large amounts of capital, in the accumulation of power, they also thereby not only accumulate power, but an asymmetry to that world. And in the design of that asymmetry of that world, because the power accumulation is so large, you accumulate a tendency for psychopathic relationship to that world. And so I think this sort of nuance of we design the world and the world designs us is something that I think is quite powerful. And I think one of the big traps we're caught into is those recursive loops have become so large that we are trapped in those modalities. And I think it's all around us. 400 years of organizing the world through dominion, through perspective, i.e. the kind of construction of distance and also the construction of asymmetry, classification theory, all the way through to thereby its manifestation in property, its dehumanization. All of this stuff is rooted in these concepts that we've then rooted and built our institutions, but also reinterpreted ourselves. And one of the classic examples I use, Nate, is in terms of genetic diversity, Africa, the continent, is more genetically diverse than the rest of the whole world. Yet, in terms of racialization, we have racialized on the basis of power and distancing as a means to exert and dehumanize in a particular way. So I think what's fascinating to me is how these concepts have constructed the world and thereby constructed our relationships and our perceptions of self. And there's this recursive loop, which I think is really challenging. And this goes all the way around. And that's, I think, the kind of entangled trap we're in the middle of.
I think it goes way beyond 400 years ago. I think it goes back to the agricultural revolution. And when Cortez found South America, there were already canals and temples and priests and hierarchy, and that was over 1,000 years ago. So I think the 400 years ago is when we started, true globalization, and it eventually hit industrialization with the massive amount of energy surplus from carbon, and that turbocharged the dynamic that you're discussing. So I have a bunch of questions there, but before we go and any further, I just want to ask you just a personal question. With the context of what you just said, what does it mean to you to be human, and how the way we design the world around us, how do you think that brings out the best and the worst of the qualities of being human alive today?
And this is, I think, the project. In a way, I would argue this is the greatest project that I think is often under-discussed in our age. So I think, what does it mean to be human now? I think this is the foundational challenge. I think we've rooted ourselves in a theory of humans as individual and as objecthoods. And I think one of the key journeys that we're in the middle of is, one, to reimagine ourselves as not just beings but becomings, i.e. developmental. Two, imagine ourselves as multitudes, i.e. we are not a singular but an emergent plural. And three, to actually reimagine ourselves as interbeings, as beings in relationship and dialogue with. So our lungs are an extension and in relationship with the trees. And this, to me, the science of this stuff is already there, as is the philosophy, and it's been there for, some could argue 50 years, some could argue millennia. I think the project is that our institutional logics are so far, and our cultural norms are now so out of delta with, or out of deviation with the science of this project. I think this is what the challenge that we're facing, and this is the project. So I would argue, for me, that is probably at the kind of core base project of the transition that we're in the middle of, and I think is under-discussed, under-invested, and under-deliberated. And I think there's something, this is how I would interpret it, and I think it's really vital part. And we often talk about transition from a theory of objecthood, or, new products, new services, new supply chains. And we often talk about it from that level. And then if we're really smart, maybe we talk about institutions. But I think the deeper project is the revolution in how we imagine ourselves. And history would always say, I would argue, that every epochal period is actually equivalently a transformation of how we imagine ourselves as it is in a transformation of the world around us.
I'm kind of glad that we didn't do a podcast right after I met you, because if you had just said what you just said a year ago, I kind of might have scoffed or let it flow over my head. But now I feel it. I feel the resonance of what you just said, because I've matured and gone beyond my analysis of the situation more to the deeper level, or I'm still a kindergartner in those domains, but I'm experiencing it. So let me ask you this. And by the way, when you say the project, you don't mean Dark Matter Labs project. You mean the project, capital T, capital P, for humanity. Yes.
Absolutely. I think this is the project for all of humanity, and I think it's an extraordinary invitation. By the way, this is not it's not a minor solve the problem project. It's a sort of, I don't know if you've read James Lovelock's Nova Scene. The first third of it is extraordinary because I think he lays out the thesis of a planetary consciousness being born. And his narration of our history, I think, is really beautiful because he narrates all the beautiful energy blindness that you talk about, but he narrates it in a different way, which I think is really interesting, where he says the Earth has stored vast amounts of solar energy, which is it's expended and to the maximum it can in giving birth to an 8.5 billion unit planetary consciousness to become self-aware.
Yeah, that sounds a little more poetic than my language.
No, but it's equivalent. I think there's just two ways of describing a sort of moment that we're living in, which I think is extraordinary. That way of narrating is also rooted in the same issue. It is rooted in the reimagination of ourselves and our relationship to the planet at a fundamental level.
So I know that you are aware of my work and have read it and seen videos, and you probably follow the podcast. Here's kind of a burning question that I have after doing a review of your work and hearing you so far. How much of our behavior is a product of the sunk cost of our infrastructure and social structure, to use Marvin Harris's terms? And part two question is, if we were hypothetically able to freeze everyone in the world in stasis and redesign the infrastructure and our social structure, our laws, institutions, knowing what we know about system science and all the things that you and Dark Matter Labs work on, how radically different would our housing, our streets, our laws be? In other words, there's such a sunk cost that comes with our at the margin decisions of what to do this month or this quarter. And it's all based on the metabolism of what's been building and happening over prior decades or even centuries. And boy, we would like to do this, but we're stuck with what we already have. So we're just making decisions building on top of that giant, disconnected, non-well-being, non-ecologically tethered Rube Goldberg mousetrap. That was a mouthful. What do you think, Indy?
No, I think you're right. And the word I suppose I'm looking for is not. I think we're locked into path dependencies. As opposed to just infrastructures. I think it's not even the fact that our existing infrastructure is locking us in. I think we're locked into replication of that infrastructure because the meta metrics, whether it's GDP, you've done brilliant critiques of that, or our theory of, I think the level of how we recognize our own agency and our own value in the world is through accumulation and consumption. Those incentives are so deeply coded that we're locked into these systemic path dependencies. And I think those path dependencies, for me, are the things that are really manifestly trapping up. They're almost invisible infrastructures, like vector infrastructures as opposed to sort of static infrastructures. We often talk about the stasis infrastructures of dependency, but I think we're locked into vector infrastructures that are locking us into these trajectories, which I haven't got language for, Nate, if I'm really honest.
So I understand and agree with you that there are multiple path dependencies of our culture, the metabolism of how our economy is going forward. Either theoretically or pragmatically, could you outline how we would get out of those path dependencies? Is it an individual change in consciousness, and then that scales with more than one individual and groups of individuals? Is it a top-down rule change? Is it a crisis, and then we have to react and chart a new pathway with a new metabolism that's lower scale and more ecologically tethered? What are your thoughts on changing the path dependencies?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really, I think there's multiple points on this. And what we're learning is that there are fissures which are opening up landscapes for new possibilities. Now, I would argue places like Canada, where indigenous worldviews and crown and common law worldviews are colliding, and opening up new landscapes, there is new possibilities emerging for ways to perceive and break the orthodoxies of these vector path dependencies, because they're inviting us to do that. I would argue that I think the African continent is going to give birth to new forms of monetary mechanisms as resource-based monies are going to be born in terms of liquidity crunches. I would argue that there are possibilities that are opened up in places like Stockholm to look at the intangible value of mental health as a strategic collective asset. So what we're seeing is different landscapes are opening up different fissures into the future, which I think is really worth recognizing. Second, I do think that I think our capacity to change will be rooted in how crisis shifts and opens the Overton window for actually crisis-driven models of change. I think that will be another path dependency on that. And then I think there is another architecture, which is I would argue there are locations in the world which require preemptive peace strikes, because their cascading planetary scale risks are so of an order of magnitude that they would drive planetary scale mutually assured destruction.
Are you thinking about Brazil and the Amazon, or are you thinking about Russia and the war with NATO?
I'm thinking about Brazil and the Amazon. I'm thinking about the Himalayas. I'm thinking about locations in the world which open up pathways of such superscale mass destruction that preemptive peace becomes the cognitively smart. And I use the word preemptive peace intentionally as a recognition of how we use military language to be able to pre-declare a new position. And I think the preemptive peace strikes are going to be critical assets. So I think crisis will open up certain landscapes. Preemptive peace in strategic localities will open up new landscapes. I also think constraints are going to open up new landscapes. And I think one of the things that I think the West has not been used to, and I use the West colloquially and I hate it, but as a term, but let's use it as a soft language. I think we've not been used to operating how constraints shift the spaces of innovation. So as we see, your work does this beautifully, is, I think all of Europe can, if it was to recognize its carbon budgets, is only able to build 176,000 homes a year. Its current budget of homes construction is somewhere in the region of 1.5 million plus. And that's because actually, if they was to follow the Paris Accord, it just doesn't have the carbon budgets available. And those constraints are going to shift, I would argue, the spaces of how we provide spatial justice, how we use material resources in radical new ways. So I think constraint-driven transformation is also another critical pathway, as we are seeing these kind of fissure landscapes as well.
On the response to crisis, is it like, no, crisis, we respond? Or is it, there's a crisis coming, let's have some conversations locally and regionally about how to respond to the upcoming crises, and there's a preparation ahead of it? Or do you mean just literally unexpected thing like happened last week in Asheville, North Carolina, where they got 30 inches of rain and now they're responding? Is it more of that sort of thing?
Well, what I'm sensing is more like as we got 30 inches of rain, we suddenly realized that insurance companies are backing off in vast parts. And that is the underlying actual crisis, because suddenly what you see is the meta effects behind that, and that changes the landscape. So the crisis is not just the physical manifestation, it's when the underlying dark matter starts to shift and break.
Can you explain what dark matter is? That's the name of your organization, but I'm not sure that I fully understand it, which means our listeners probably don't either.
So we use dark matter as a term that behind the visible world, i.e., the visible crisis, the house, is a set of institutional infrastructures, norms, and mechanisms that allow a certain reality to persist. So, for example, in order to buy a house, if you want to get a mortgage, you need to have insurance. And if you don't have insurance, you can't actually get a mortgage. And so as you lose insurability in a kind of what I'd call in a scalar climate breakdown with some global weather volatilities, we are losing insurability and thereby losing the access to capital markets, which is thereby going to drive a concentration of assets and a distribution of distressed assets. So inequality will scale. So what I'm talking about is those institutional frames that sit underneath the house and its physical construction that actually create those reinforcing logics. So often in the crisis, there's what I would call the visible crisis and the real crisis. And then there is the crisis underneath that, which I think is where once you start to recognize that, you start to recognize the fundamental, I think it's a reality quakes, where where our reality starts to shudder at a much more structural level. And it's those sorts of crises that tend to shift the landscape quite fundamentally and create new politics.
A non sequitur, but I'm just curious, what were you like in grade school and high school, Indy? Were you just an average kid, or were you thinking and talking like this back then?
My reality was I was into philosophy very early on, and I was trying to see how to see the world, and that's been a lot of my journey. But I think my real thing has been that the privilege I've really had is to operate at the intersection of different worlds, whether it's building startups or whether it's building platforms and physically making these types of institutions, or whether it's building capital structures, which has allowed me to understand and operate across these languages. And that's the other challenge that I think we have. And I think people, many people in your podcast and other people have spoken about this. I think one of the big challenges that we have is these problems are intersectional. They operate across disciplines. Yet actually most of us are so disciplinary focused that our ability to look at the intersections of the disciplines and where the opportunity spaces is really marginal. So I think there's a kind of new type of polymathic capability that's required to look at these problem spaces and to be able to go from the house and the water and the rainfall and the weather system to the insurance system to look at the political effects of that, and thereby look at what the Overton windows are for transformation.
I haven't voiced it as such, but that's exactly what I'm trying to do with the podcast and these conversations, because it's not a single topic. It's how all the topics intersect, both the natural science and the human side of it. So thank you. Thank you for that.
Not at all. And Nate, I just want to say, I think that is one of the exceptional contributions of this podcast. I listened to you and Ed Conway speak, for example, and the material limits and material possibilities on the system as he was placing it, but also the energy infrastructures and obviously your conversation with Daniel Schmachtenbergers. So I think what you're building is this intersectional worldview. And I think this is absolutely vital, because I think if you only take a disciplinary worldview, you try to solve the world with the hammer, because all you see is nails. And that's because that's all you can see. And I think this is a really key contribution.
Before I move on, we could just spend the rest of our time talking about what you've just shared so far, but could you define what you mean specifically by preemptive peace? And are you working on that with Dark Matter Labs? Like, is that something you're trying to influence?
Yeah. And from our perspective, there are locations in the world which have pathways to catastrophic planetary scale risks. And it does not take a genius to recognize that those risks require new forms of discoveries of peace. And I think the word peace is underrated, because I would argue that on one landscape, you could argue that we've been in systemic war at our ecological substrate. And that war is through extraction and externalization. And those microaccretions of war are now accumulating to the point of self-termination. And the war is not just kinetic, it's at every scale. And actually, for us to discover a new peace, which I think is actually, and I think the violence is also felt at the human bodily level. I don't know, increasingly when I'm speaking both publicly, I think people can perceive the violence in their economic realities, and I use this word softly, but I think people in what I call networked enslavement that I think people feel in their theory of labor, reducing people to units of labor, reducing people to being, how do you weaponize them into the economy? How do you, and the words often used are incentivize, or all this sort of language that we've used, which actually turns us into commodities of agents, into a macroeconomy. So I think this violence is felt at every level. And I think this is where the thesis of peace actually invites a new psychological state that I think people can perceive as a new politics, as a language of a new politics, spell words that allow us to, as well as I think language of freedom. And I think the freedom not just to be what I would say freedom of economic choice, which I think is usually a freedom to escape the tyranny of the system, but a freedom to be radically human, which is to construct a system that ennobles us in a different way. So I think I would argue that this peace, this freedom to be radically human, and that the preemptive aspect is recognizing the locations where these situations do exist right now and are predictable, and our security services are able to perceive them. And the construction of this peace is not just a member state issue or between states. It's a sort of what I would call a multi-agent issue, because I no longer think that states are the only agents of power in the system. And so our ability to construct peace is also a different form of negotiation in that landscape, and to construct the conditions for peace is different as well. And that goes back into, I think, other forms of theory of where sovereignty is no longer through the theory of state. I think we're seeing an explosion of sovereignties. And in that explosion of sovereignties, we have to construct a different theory of negotiation and peace construction in that reality as well. And I know I've gone into a whole tirade of stuff there, but I think these are the logic flows. And we're looking at these issues.
First of all, what you just said maps a lot to what I refer to as the economic superorganism, which doesn't treat us or care about us as individuals. There's a downward causation that it only values our contribution to the global amassing of surplus, which of course itself is not shared equally and doesn't use the right prices, both on scarcity and ecological impact. But what did you mean about the sovereignty and change from the nation states able to solve this to something beyond the part of the state? Where would the sovereignty go if not by the state?
I think this is so. There's two points I want to come into on this, Nate. I think one is the economic superorganism, which I think you elegantly describe, is also now self-terminating. So it's terminating itself, and it's terminating us in symbiotic relationship. And I think it is also a resultant function of being an extractive optimizing system. And I think it's also no longer just a moral issue. I think that extractive system can no longer efficaciously operate in complexity and in a new human-machine economy. As our machine economy and our human economy is evolving, which I think is symbiotically evolving in this phase, I think we're starting to have to look at the agentification of the world, not just the agentification of the world through LLMs and sort of generative AI, but the re-agentification of the world through whether it's self-sovereign rivers, or in New Zealand, mountains being recognized as having their own agency, or river systems of forest. So we're seeing the re-agentification of the world to deal with complexity and entanglements. And this is a new theory, I would argue, of organizing in complexity, as we've now got the computational capacity and the bureaucratic capacity to operate and recognize no longer in dominion and control, but in relationship to agentification. So this worldview that's made available to us is a function of a new bureaucratic capability that we've unleashed. And I think that allows us to operationalize complexity in a way that our old bureaucratic systems could not. And I think we were going to self-terminate. That also means that our theory of governance can no longer be rooted in control, but has to be rooted in what I would say is ennobling and learning infrastructures. So as opposed to control theory, the role of governance is an emergent function of building the learning capacity of an agentified worldview that tips our theory of operating in the superorganism no longer becomes a superorganism of extraction and optimizing, but becomes an ennobling organism at the back end. And I think that flip is, I think, available because our bureaucratic frameworks have shifted and our capabilities and technology have shifted in one way. Now, this I know is a very hopeful and a hyper, maybe over hopeful position, but I think it's cognitively available to us, and it aligns with, I think, psychological needs, but also new bureaucratic capabilities.
So this is our first real conversation, so I want to make sure that I understand some of your vocabulary. You mentioned agentified world of agency. Can you briefly describe what you mean by an agentified world?
So on the technology level, it would be how we can actually distribute the ability to make situational actions and decisions that can be autonomous and distributed. And they can be contingent and learning orientated. So now that is not just a function of computational power, it's also a sort of how we're starting to look at nature rights and nature sovereignty. It's also looking at new types of organizing theory, which is rooted in shifting from control orientation to learning orientation systems. So we're seeing this agentification in a kind of semi-poetic way, and I apologize for using this language. It's kind of operating out of seeing the world through our economics sees the world through a world of dead things and dominion. I think this allows us to see the world through living things, or living is a bit too emotional, but agentified, operational, to be enlivened in the world. And I think that paradigm, and we often talk about this as life ennobling economics, an economic theory that is rooted in ennobling life. And the life is not just human life, but human, non-human, computational living systems, which I think is the paradigmatic leap that we have to make to operate in complexity.
So instead of just the economic superorganism and the humans riding high on that structure having agency, an agentic view of life is we all have agency, including the river and the trees and the mountains and the biosphere.
And the technological infrastructures as well. So this is why it builds a different framework.
I like it. And then you've used a word 3 or 4 times, entangled, an entanglement. Is that an important word?
It is, because I think if we only exist as the idea of objects in ennoblement, I think the objecthood is insufficient. It's, where we talked about it's not just beings, but becomings, but interbecomings. I know this is a series of language, beings, becomings to interbecomings, which recognizes that actually, you and I are in relationship. Our lungs are extensions in relationship with trees because they provide the oxygen for our lungs. We're in a symbiotic relationship with ecological systems. And I think unless we can conceive and operate in that entanglement and conceive ourselves in that entanglement, and that entanglement requires us to operate in a theory of care. This is, I think, the real leap, is that you have to operate in a theory of we have agency, and we recognize our agency is our theory of freedom. And then we have to recognize we operate in an entanglement, and thereby we operate in a theory of care and being in relationship to. And that is a different type of beingness in the world, or relating to the world. And I think this is the nuance that I think we're moving into, where we move away from power over to being in care with. That's a different sort of metabolism of being.
I love that. I thought we were going to talk about housing, but I kind of like this direction better. You're in England and I'm in Minnesota, so we don't technically have an energetic field between us right now, though you might educate me on that. But in talking with you, Indy, my nervous system is calmed, and I feel in relationship. I'm with you in this conversation. What's up with that? Is that part of the entanglement, even though we're an ocean apart, connected via technology, transmitting up at 20,000 miles in the sky and back down?
I think the reality is, I would argue, we're in a community of fate together, Nate. Our fates are so systemically entangled and non-divisible that I think that's one dimension of it. I think there is a dimension that you and I and our existence is entangled with the Amazon and other critical organisms that our fates are non-divisible in our substrates. And then I think there is the fact that you and I knowledge bases and our so-called intelligences are entangled in bodies of work that we have both read and conceived and worked with and iterated off and admired. So there's, we stand on the shoulders of similar giants. And I think the third dimension, which I think is also, or fourth dimension, which I think is equally important, is that I do think that there is a lot of really interesting work about at what level the universe and our brains, and there is kind of conjecture about, the thought being a quantum process, and what level of that operates in a different dimension that you and I yet cannot possibly put words to. And I'm sure a brilliant scientist could give us. There are documents and papers out there that start to talk about that. So I think there's multiple dimensions of this. And this to me is the kind of paradigmatic moment where I think theory of separation and competition as a means of evolution are now reaching the point that actually our entanglements and our mutual assured pathways are so deeply entangled that we have to find a new pathway for development, which isn't through competition. And I think this is, some would argue, this is the Fermi paradox moment, I would argue anyway, that unless a civilization can transcend competitive evolution and to find a different pathway which recognizes entangled co-evolutionary landscapes, I think it tends to fall and die because it actually goes into competition to the point where mutually assured destruction pathways are so dominant. And I think this is the moment of a developmental quantum leap is required from us as a species.
I agree with you. And yet it's going to happen at the same inflection point where society as a whole, relative to our recent past, moves from an abundance to a scarcity mindset, when as individuals, we're called to move from a scarcity to an abundance mindset. You just mentioned yourself that there's only technically, given our footprint, room for 100-some thousand, I forgot your numbers, 100,000 extra houses in Europe per year, yet they're building 1 million. So we're going to have that switch towards collaboration and interdependence. At the same time, we're getting cultural signals of scarcity and competition. Yes?
I think this is exactly it. And this is the kind of flip moment that I think if there's a politics to be constructed, there will be this moment that there will be greater efficacy in a new political arrangement, which actually transcend us for this moment. Or, and I think this is a fork moment, and I don't think this is a gradient, or we reach a moment where, mutually assured destruction becomes the inevitable path because the othering, because this is the other key moment, as those abundances turn into scarcities then drive us into otherings. And otherings are separational frameworks. And as the more we try to do that, we will set the pathway to a type of war and destruction and conflict. And, it may be some of it will be kinetic, some of it will be resource orientated. So we'll reach that path. But I think this is visible to us now. And I think the choices are, and this is why I talked about these key political languages of a great peace, the freedom to be radically human. Are there new offerings that create these radical new abundances that outstrip the material abundances to which we've currently orientated our theories of value and wealth.
How would you define, if you had to give an elevator pitch to someone that you met or someone that's listening to this show, what does it mean to you to have the freedom to be radically human? What does that mean?
I'll give an example, which is, I don't know what your experience of COVID was, but I can imagine many people's experience of COVID. There was a moment in COVID where the streets were quiet, where you were with your kids or, families, and the homo economist rationale of incentives, structures, languages started to erode. And there were glimpses made available to a different life and a different thesis of what it meant to be a person. And I think that was a sort of a glimpse, a fracture into a much bigger idea that I think we are trapped into, I would argue, our homo economist reductive narrative. And I think there are many spiritual movements that talk about this stuff in many formats, but I would argue that we are starting to see fractures in those realities. And I think, you could argue there are many, many of these intentional communities that are starting to explore where we recognize that we do not just operate in the orchestration of financial capital, and not just in the theory of contract and asymmetric power, but in relationships of care. So I think we've all started to experience this in moments. And I think there's also, what is perhaps more easily experienced is how entrapped people feel. When we mutually recognize how entrapped we are, I think there's a sort of space of what does a real freedom to manifest our completeness of being. And to be freedom to be in care. To freedom to be in care is a different type of freedom to a freedom to consume. And to be in care, you have to, when you're with your kids or with your close family members or somebody else, care is not a transaction. It's not an economic relationship. It is a mutual developmental relationship in its best form. And you are both developing that relationship. So I think we've seen glimpses of this. And I think this is also critical as machine computational capabilities mean that the human contribution to the economy as a bad robot is no longer sufficient as a contribution to the theory of value. So I think we're also being displaced and moved forward. And I think there's a new invitation for a new human-machine economy that will invite us to expand our theory of being human and thereby embodied theories of intelligence, multi-capital forms of value, situational intelligences, ways of being in different formats. So I think we've glimpsed it. And I think I also try not to over-describe it, because I think it needs to be discovered and not colonized from an old world view, because I think I am merely on this side of the bridge describing what's on the other side of the bridge. But I can tell you there's something interesting there, but I can't yet. I'm not it.
So there is a positive feedback happening in this conversation, because now I have more questions than I did a few minutes ago. So what do you mean by a human-machine economy?
So I think we've always had some form of relationship with some form of toolification. And you could argue that human tool economy created asymmetric capabilities.
Okay, so it could have been a hammer made with a stone, or a spear was a human machine in its primitive sense.
Exactly, and we've been scaling up this new human-machine economy in forms of evolution, and every one of those have displaced and mutually developed the human construction. So the Industrial Revolution, for example, was made possible in the UK because UK had already done educational reforms, and it had greater distribution of wealth than than Holland had or Netherlands had, which meant the educational reforms combined with the distribution of wealth created the capacity, and the abundance of coal and other things created the capacity for a form of feedback of innovation, of human resource and foundational natural capabilities to be able to do that. I think we're in another one of these moments where I think machine capabilities are going to co-evolve, and we are in a moment to co-evolve as we start to drive automation, generative AI, and all these sort of things are inviting a new form of a more embodied intelligence, which I think machines are, multi-forms of intelligence that I think machines are not yet able to provide.
So I assume you watched a few months ago, I did an episode with Daniel Schmachtenberger on AI and the environment, and that under our current use of AI, it is downstream from the economic superorganism, and so it's going to make everything conceptually more efficient, better at extracting, better at everything, and that additional productivity will act like a larger siphon of the natural world. What is your view on AI, generative AI? Could we rein it in to have a net positive towards this emergence that you're talking about, or is it fraught with peril?
There's two fundamental challenges, I would argue, that our current generative AI structures are being built into 19th century organisms.
Well, it's like the metabolism and the sunk costs that we talked about. We've got this wonderful technology, but we have all this built infrastructure that we're just, putting it on top of as a patch. Yes?
Exactly. So we're building into the 19th century idea or the 17th century idea of the corporation as a theory of value, when actually, generative AI is an emergent societal product. It's a function of emergent societal capabilities. So that's one dimension. And I think the problem is that those institutional frames are rooted in theories of control and optimization of assets, as opposed to optimization of outcomes. So there's logic problems that we've got in the institutional institutional landscape, which is driving our technology to root itself in theory of control, manipulation, and bias. So I think often I think we conflate the problem of technology with the problem of institutions, one dimension. And I find it helpful to break the two apart, because I think it allows us maybe to fix the right problem. And thereby, I also believe if you fix the institutional problem, I think we might be designing different forms of technologies and their different manifestation cycles as well. Second, I think the problem I think we also have is how we're building, as I understand it, the weighting systems and how we're coding the information into these recursive systems and learning systems is rooted in a particular worldview. It's rooted in particular biases of intelligences, and thereby we're losing the plurality of what I'd call complex embodied knowledges and accelerating dominant singular perspectives. And I think this is at a system level, a systemic loss, because the accelerative power of that framework becomes so advanced and so complementary it will overrun other forms of embodied intelligence and be able to articulate that. And I think that requires a systemic recognition of value destruction and what value is at risk and where value is being created.
So AI in that sense is accelerating the Walmartization of our culture.
Precisely. But I want to engage with it because I also think it offers a pathway, like I was originally saying, of re-agentifying the world. And it allows us to take our current dead views of the world and start to operate in a new form of agency into it. Now, that is also available as a result of it, but this requires us to operate and recognize all the work that's happening around frames of, frame setting between generative intelligences, situational. And there's a lot of stuff happening that I think is really interesting and I think could be a transformative moment to create a new form of ennobling infrastructures, not control infrastructures in society and agentification infrastructures. However, I think we must recognize these codings of risk that we're coding into our current manifestations of those technologies.
I'm following you here, Indy, and I'm seeing where you're going, or where we would all like to go. What role does education have in this? Because, we're talking, most people watching this show are 40s, 50s, 60s, and they're understanding what the risks are and the pathways. But what about 12, 15, 18, 22-year-olds? What is their role in this different future that is emergent and respects the global commons and is not so extractive and all the things you've been talking about? Don't we need to inculcate a different lens through the education system for young people, or what are your thoughts on that?
Completely. I mean, I think the biggest regret that I have is right now, if you look at the transition conversations we're all part of, everyone is focusing on, material, energy, decarbonization, what I would call mitigation strategies to preserve the current, as you would call it, the economic superorganism. But actually, none of them are dealing with the profound developmental conversations that are rooted in how we incentivize, how we grow, how we nurture actually the next generation. And my risk is that we're still we're building the same context for them to repeat the same behaviors that we manifest. And worse still, I think we are not able to break. I mean, let's put it this way. You could make an argument that we are a function of our traumas. And many of us have been victims of a field of trauma construction, which is then weaponizes us to operate in a very particular way. And I worry that we are intergenerationally handing over these traumas to a next generation rather than actually making a firewall, a fire break between our generation and the next to allow for a conscious beyond trauma transition, which I think is vital, because otherwise we will implicate and pass through the violence that we've been operating with, because I think we are functions of that violence rooted in us and at every level, incentive systems, competition theory, everything else.
So we're a function of our trauma and our infrastructure together.
And the infrastructure provides the frameworks of trauma. And thereby also those have become the residual roots of how our behaviors manifest into the future. And I think the risk is that we are not able to create a fire break between the traumas that we carry and we hand them over to the next generation, who thereby then find it massively more difficult in terms of escaping the economic superorganism or transforming it or recoding it.
Okay, let me repackage this in the way that is my language and my work, and then you can reply. So there's two general timelines ahead. We have to live differently in the not too distant future, and that's going to be different infrastructure, different rules, different institutions, and different attitudes and values. But between here and there, there's a miracle that happens in the middle, which is the bend, not break, all the different transitional things to hold society together, to not have war, to not have the Amazon turn into a savanna and have runaway warming and all the things. So there's two components, two timelines, and also two components. One is our infrastructure and the housing and the energy flows and the taxes and the incentives, and the two is the values and the consciousness and where people come from their heart. And so what you're saying is, if we don't have that second thing in transit changing, that the first thing isn't really going to be solved. So we have to do both of those things at both of those timelines. What are your thoughts?
Precisely. And I would argue that whether you look at the Industrial Revolution or other forms of revolutions that civilizations have gone through, it is usually a symbiotic function between our new technological capabilities and our reimaginations of what it means to be human, our educational capabilities, to be reductive. And I think it is the same sort of symbiotic transformation that we're in the middle of. And I think we're going to have to do those two in symbiosis.
Okay, so that brings me to this question. Earlier in this conversation, and often in your work, you use the phrase, what we design designs us back. But what we designed, or what was designed by emergence and time and energy surplus and dominion extractive hierarchies, exists now, and we're building on top of that. And so it's hard to design something for the future without this momentum already playing out. So are there ways to, like you said earlier, COVID, we had a glimpse of what it meant to be something different, what it meant to be, the freedom to be radically human. Are there little test pilots or, trial periods? Can we do this now in small groups or communities or something larger, that we design something in a VR trial sense, so that that opens our heart and opens our imagination and creates an Overton window for us to be better able to face these things when they really happen?
Absolutely. I mean, we're working, for example, Jane Engel is working in Canada.
I was just with her 2 weeks ago.
Exactly. And so she's working with PAM and the Friendship Center, looking at how do you make land self-sovereign, which is about, and this is because it rhymes with indigenous ways of being, but it also builds this kind of conversation of the re-agentification of the world. So we're seeing at the kind of nexus point between indigenous worldviews and common law worldviews, these new possibilities emerge. We're seeing, like every city, most cities in the world have declared that they need new forms of tree canopies and ecological infrastructures as a key resilience strategy. So they know that there's a theory of value in the tree canopies, even though the current accounting systems can't price them. So the perception of value and the political recognition of value is now acting as a forcing function to transform the theory of accounting and the theory of attribution. But it also recognizes that trees planted by communities have a 90% chance of survival versus tree planted by municipalities, because the relationships of value of care is so significant. So we're seeing this, whether we talk about the collective intelligence of a city being recognized as a strategic asset, as an emergent asset, non-divisible emergent asset, which has strategic outcomes, is being recognized and thought through. We know our material economics and, our theory of material as a theory of ownership is perhaps insufficient as a means to govern materials, whether we need to now talk about being custodian relationships to material economies, holding the incumbency of full life relationships to the stewardship of that. There's brilliant explorations we're in the middle of looking at how to look at electric batteries with new forms of, stewardship and custodian relationships, as opposed to ownership relationships and waste relationships.
I don't understand that. What do you mean by that? A custodial relationship for electric batteries?
So, for example, it is not that I own it. I have a duty of responsibility to use it and care for it, so it can be handed over in a relationship of care to be managed and recycled. It is not a product of ownership and disposal. And I think there are there's a beautiful Taiwanese phrase, which a colleague of mine, Fang, there's a house in Taiwan, and the indigenous people of Taiwan say they ask the river permission to borrow the stones, and they promise to give the stone back to the river. Now, in that thesis, they have borrowed the stones from nature. They are looking to be custodians of it, and they recognize their responsibility to return it.
And if they don't fulfill their responsibility, nature will take it back in the form of a hurricane.
Precisely. And but also socially, we construct these rules, right? We construct the social arrangements around them. What I'm finding interesting is we now have the bureaucratic frameworks to construct these new material economies. These don't just have to be what I would call soft cultural relationships. We can construct institutional arrangements around these sorts of ways of working. So I would argue that these are manifesting now in many, many dimensions. And we were talking about resource-backed currencies. I'm pretty convinced in the African continent, we're going to see a whole birth of resource-backed currencies as people look to Africa for resource, but actually the liquidity can be rooted into future ecological minerals and how they can create a new form of circularity around how their mineral resources are. We're going to see innovation. And I think we're going to see this in all these dimensions around the world. So I don't sit there with a sort of, I sit there with these fissures being opened up, as we were discussing earlier.
Okay, let me ask you a very difficult question, and you have as long as you like to answer it. So we have roughly a 19 terawatt metabolism right now. The 8 billion humans use effectively 190 billion 100-watt light bulbs are turned on 24/7. You and I would generally agree this is unsustainable. And in the not-too-distant future, we're going to have a smaller scale of energy and material throughput on average on the planet. So knowing all that you know and your work on architecture and the meta crisis and everything, if we were able to hypothetically freeze everything now, and therefore the built infrastructure is not necessarily causing an additional metabolic building on top of it, given everything you know, how would you restructure society in the housing, infrastructure, economic laws sort of things to be better aligned with a lower throughput future in the next 50 to 100 years?
Wow. Okay.
Bring out your paintbrush, Indy.
Okay, I'll sort of engage it, and I think I want to. My first thing would be food systems, actually. I think it's super clear that our food systems are going to be one of the first things to go into crisis, both as a result of climate breakdown and other forms of fragilities that are systemically emerging. So I think the transformation of our food system, which I think predominantly, I would argue, is going to have to move towards plant-based food diets as a function of reducing our energy input and making sure, I think you referred to it elegantly as kind of where I think our food system is net endothermic, i.e. we consume some more energy than the energy it provides. So
a lot more.
A lot more. And I think we're going to, moving towards a plant-based food diet, I think we're going to have to move towards combination of shifting our food systems to being rooted in rewilded multi-species farming, which I think thereby sustains the soil at a higher level, but also increases the nutrition density of our food systems, where that will support a new form of precision farming, probably relatively local to reduce logistics and transportation burdens on our energy systems. That will almost certainly be combined, I think, unfortunately, with some form of controlled food environments as a resilience buffer in those situations, and some form of VAT system. So we'll live in this hybridities. I think that will be one of the first transition pathways. I think in terms of transportation, my argument is that the electric bike is actually the future of transportation. It is per mile. I think we spoke about this. It is the most effective. It preserves pretty much all of our economic geographies, and per unit mile is probably the most efficient. I think if we were to take a more radical future, I would say autonomous three-wheelers would be the kind of game changer in terms of actually the second order framework. So I think the shifting of our transportation systems would be the second move I would really focus on. Third move would be actually looking into our provision of how we do spatial justice in terms of actually the level
spatial justice.
Yes. So the equitable distribution of the spaces in the environments of our city. There are many homes right now, certainly in Europe, that are lying empty, that are preserved as assets, financial assets with actually zero utility because of the net appreciation that they're accumulating on the basis of stability value as opposed to utility value. I think we are going to have to resolve that as a recognizing there is a net societal cost of actually preserving it as a non-utilized asset. And And I think we're going to have to open that up into and use incentive and also other forms of function to be able to equity share space. I think that's going to have to be, so I think there's a whole dimension about what level of construction. We're then going to have to rebuild our biomaterial economy. So I would pretty much talk about, in the UK, for example, has not one structural timber managed forest. And we're going to have to rebuild our biomaterial economy, both to act as forest, carbon pumps and carbon sinks, but also with our nutrition cycle to rebuild our construction capabilities over a 20 to 30 year cycle. And that will be also about restabilizing our soil systems. And then I think there's a sort of, those are the kind of macro fields that I think they're sitting in. The energy infrastructure, I would just recommend everyone just listen to you. I think you've described it so well. I think our
I described the problem. I don't know the solution.
Well, I mean, I think demand management as well as supply side. My big worry is that everyone often talks about the invention of supply, and I think actually demand reconstruction is going to be a critical part. Our material economy, I already spoke about, that we're going to have to make it fabulously more circular. So that would, and the problem with circular materials is not the physical reality, it's our institutional reality, i.e. material passports and our capability to insure these products. So it's the institutional frameworks for circularity and who owns the end of life liability. How do you construct those chains of liabilities and the incentive systems? So, for example, a building doesn't account for the materials on the balance sheet of a building. So it's actually, we're going to have to recode how we account for the material costs and the embodied energies and other frameworks into those things. And that will change the near zero material economy. We won't be doing new build. If we're doing new build, it will almost certainly be roof extensions. We will almost be certainly looking at biomaterial basis and textile construction as a means to actually be able to construct new forms of envelope frameworks. I think we'll be looking at new forms of intangible assets. That will be the places of strategic growth, mental health of a city, the decision-making capacity of a city, the collective intelligence of a city. I think this will be spaces of new forms of abundance. I think we'll rebuild the balance sheet of a city rooted in ecological infrastructure of a city as a key part of its productivity cycle. If I'm being really far off, I would start to imagine almost new economies of we talk about self-sovereign homes or sort of this sort of new form of property tenure, which allows for the efficacy of these environments without becoming rent-seeking systems. I think then we also go, slightly further off into that future, that we can start to imagine not only intangible how societies make decisions and the capacities of societies to make decisions in complex, volatile situations will be a strategic asset. So I think we'll change our theory of where value and balance sheet and risk is understood in fundamental ways. So I think one of the weird moments is that we will change a lot, but I'm not sure the city will change as visibly as we've kind of imagined in all of our beautiful 2050, 2060 sci-fi films. I think what we're going to change is all sorts of invisible logics of our city and where our theory of values is accruing from.
So you've thought about this before?
Well, it was not just once.
So let me ask you this. Many people blame capitalism as the root of a lot of the issues you're describing. I actually don't, because I think it precedes capitalism, the dynamic of the superorganism. But do you see a similar issue? Do you see it that way? And what would you say to people that are suggesting that communism or socialism are the solutions to what we face?
So I think the problem space, as I think you rightly allude to, is the individual and the collective is the same problem. Actually, you're just looking at a different scale. So the individual and the collective, I am also a collective in one view, and then the collective. I think the problem is whenever you root something and understand something through the theory of boundary and othering. And this is why I think the problem of individualism and collectivism are actually, they're all the same paradigms. And I think what we have to move from is individual and collectivism as solution spaces to new relationalities. And as soon as you do that, your theory of value goes from not the interest of the collective or the interest of the individual to actually an unbounded theory of organizing. And I think the paradigm leap this is why and this is, me being slightly controversial, I often get, I go into rooms and people say cooperatives are the future. And I was like, no, cooperatives were a brilliant answer to a 19th century problem, but they're not the future, because cooperatives still create the boundary of the other. And when you when they transact with the other, they still operate through externalization and transactions, which is why I think one of the things that we have to do is find a new operating modality to operate in entanglement in unbounded organisms. And I think money systems actually are a theory of operating in unbounded organisms. Money is a kind of organism which actually allows us to operate. Now, I think there's fundamental problems in how we've coded our money systems and designed our money systems because of the inflationary cycle in there and the money production cycles in there. But there are hints as to these complex unbounded organism capacities that exist in that system. So I would root the problem in the individual and the collective are both parts of the same paradigm, and they are both rooted in the theory of othering.
So if we move away from othering towards more of a collective in the spirit of all the things you've discussed, doesn't that then create a free rider problem where those of dark triad personality type that don't subscribe to the ecological entangled worldview that you're espousing can then take even more advantage of the people that are adhering to these principles? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes. I mean, I think this is a really important issue. Now, maybe the way I've sort of resolved this in my head is not sufficient. I just want to say this straightforwardly. I think the way I've resolved this is the free rider problem is a problem, as I often perceive it and experience it, of a 2% problem. And the problem, I think, is we turn the 2% problem into the 98% problem. And I think when you take a net system view on it, I think the losses attributable by treating the 98% as vulnerable to the free rider problem are far greater than what the free riders are consuming in the system. So I think it's I think it's where we're trying to solve the problem. I think this is where I think we end up using control as a means for 100% of systems, when actually the value unleashed by 98% of people being able to behave differently might be far in excess, is my experience, of the 2%.
So to parse that using different language, love is potentially stronger than fear?
Love, when it becomes generative and you ennoble it, I think it can scale. And I think we've designed our institutional economy. Every employment contract is rooted in a theory of fair. It's rooted in the theory of the free rider. And thereby we diminish all of us in those relationships. And we invite the lowest common relationships that are possible on the system, as opposed to the extraordinary contributions that we can all bring. And I suppose that's maybe where my sort of personal level of hope is and my belief is rooted. And I'll use the word belief. I think if we were to look at the extraordinariness of every one of us, our evolutionary journeys or whatever, 13.8 billion years of evolutionary journeys, and actually the extraordinary combinatory intelligence and capacity that we have, and yet we construct economies of reducing humans to holding doors open. I think there's something kind of lost in our theory of the potentiality and the greatness and the extraordinariness of being human. And I suppose there's a little bit of belief I have in what would it be to really unlock the extraordinariness of being human.
So let me ask you this. I'm privileged hosting this podcast to share space with bright, pro-future humans like yourself, and there's a lot of them. You mentioned Daniel Schmachtenberger. There's dozens of way smarter people than I am on this program, but you all have slightly different ideas. What would happen if you all, a couple hundred of you, thinking around the meta crisis in this way, got into a room? Does the same sort of human dynamic happen where, I want to promote my idea because Dark Matter Labs needs its funding to do this and to pay the employees? Or is there potentially an emergence that looks at the collective and is more generative and more to the 98% you were just talking about? I mean, just hypothetically, what are your thoughts on that sort of dynamic?
My intuition more and more is that the people that are really looking at this issue and crisis are recognizing the nil value point in the future unless we are able to move ourselves outside it. So any form of theoretical accumulation feels like somebody hasn't understood the problem.
I agree with that. And let me just flip the question on you. I think that's going to start happen with philanthropists and people that have accumulated wealth. They need to apply that wealth and their skills and their knowledge and their networks towards this issue. Otherwise, we all self-terminate, and what good is wealth then anyways? I do feel that is like rapidly changing the perception of our situation.
Absolutely. And if you're what I'd call a real world wealth holder, i.e. you hold land, you are starting to perceive these risks, and societal risks are now scaling in a way that is outstripping any of your theory to be able to manage them at the local level. So to managing your wealth requires you to be able to allocate to the management of societal risks, which is kind of a societal risk hedge fund. It needs to become critical investment point. So what I'm seeing is, what I love about pretty much everyone you bring on your podcast is I think across the dimensions of time and across the possibilities of space, pretty much everything is relevant. And I think we often pass everything down to actually trying to agree a moment. But I think pretty much everything on certain horizons is a vital part of that narrative and that journey that we're on. And I think most of the people that you bring on, as I also see, they recognize this point that you and I just discussed. There is no wealth at the other end of this cycle if we don't make it through. So any theory of accumulation is a false theory of wealth.
It's possible that I'm subconsciously self-selecting guests that already believe that.
It is, but I think it's also just a case. Unfortunately, I think the science is pretty much anyone who's watching the science in any format or the numbers. This is okay. So let's just dive. I think there is a body of people. Unfortunately, you could argue there is a body of people that believe that there is some pathway through this crisis, through a throttling of the human race. Right? There is a body of people. And I think that meme has become a means for the wealthy to insulate themselves psychologically, a brilliant delusion and denial mechanism to theoretically try to insulate themselves from this crisis. Yet, and Nate, you've done this, Daniel does this beautifully as well, and many others do this. If you understand the dynamics of violence that are available to us, and actually whether it's, forget the kind of primary tools of violence, but the production of antibiotics, the production of silicon chips. If we unleash that scale of violence, there is no pathway for the few to survive, because we will rip the base chords at such a fundamental level. And the unleashing, when you combine that with bioweapons and other things, there's no pathway. And I think there's some memes that we have to destroy because they're becoming delusional vessels which are actually not allowing people to just perceive what's necessary. And I think that's the other part of the story that I think is really critical. And I'm not, Daniel does obviously these game scenarios, which I think are really important, but I think we need to start to recognize these systemic entanglements and this kind of, this fork that we're facing, not a gradient.
How do we destroy a meme? Because isn't that like, don't think about an elephant, you automatically do? How would you destroy a meme?
I think the way you can undermine a meme is to make it I think these are sort of crutches. Certainly this particular one is a crutch that allows you to perceive individual survival, that doesn't allow you to engage the entanglement. And I've personally been in rooms where I've said, look, I know you've been told this by environmentalists. The Earth carrying capacity is 1 billion people, so we're going to get down to 1 billion people. And I'm like, there is no scenario that I'm aware of that allows us to smoothly get down to a throttling. I think once we unleash those traumas at every level, this is a runaway problem. Because remember, our war machine is not even accounted in our carbon function. And so once we unleash this, there's no pathway. And I think once you allow people to see the delusionary kind of conceit in that framework, I think it's unsustainable. The mean erodes itself. And I think this happened to me standing in a lunch queue where we were standing together in a lunch queue having this conversation. Do you know what I mean? Like, so, and it was really interesting for the other person. I remember this conversation, and the other person just sort of said, "Oh, that's interesting. That changes my world." And it was literally like this. And I don't think, it's not that people are possessing these beings, but they need something to deflate them because they've become frameworks of problems.
And that's one of them. And there's a lot of them. I agree. And I think the way to dispel them is like this. You just have conversations and it just shifts your consciousness about certain themes. There's so many of these memes, and you just mentioned one. And I think just having these conversations is enough to dispel in people's minds, or at least have an Overton window of changing how we think about these things. I know my own view on what we face has both crystallized and softened over the last 5 years as I have talks with people like you and others. So, Indy, what can the people watching this do to kind of be part of the scout team that is espousing these values? What are some practical suggestions for people to bring values of responsibility and stewardship and some of the things that Dark Matter Labs is trying to work on? What advice do you have for people?
I think listen to all your back catalogue. I think genuinely, one of the kind of most extraordinary contributions you've made is actually, listening to the journey that you've been recording over the last years. I think is really important. So I think exposing ourselves to these narratives and these conversations is vital. I also think we have to start to, I think one of the most transitional journeys is recognizing our interdependency. And I think one of the big challenges is the forcing functions to create the other are so large and systemic that they become easy devices of organizing, political organizing, but they're systemically not appropriate to deal with the nature of the crisis and transitions we face. And third, I would say is I really do think it's worth bearing in mind the extraordinary moment and capacity we have, the potentiality we have to pivot, to make this transition. And maybe that this throttle is the only way we'll make this pivot moment will only be made available to us as we imagine and operate into this energy throttle and this material throttle that allows us to actually reconcile and build a new capacity, which may open up a whole new forms of abundance. So I think we have to, and I think I have historically never not been a fan of, since the last few years, the word hope. But I don't mean hope in a kind of hopium sort of sense as being used by people. But I mean, I think recognizing the extraordinary potentiality of being human and actually liberating ourselves from the doctrines that have limited our own capacities and the kind of superorganism, as you rightly say, which has diminished our own capacities to see our own extraordinariness, both individually but also in entanglements and at a planetary scale. And that requires us to become quite different in both our dialogue and our relationship with each other. And I think words, my final point would be, let us become more conscious about the languages we use, because the languages we use shape the nature of the relationships we form and how we construct the world around us. And I think there's something really potent in the nature of the language and the nature of our use of language. And I think final point I would just say is that there's been beautiful writings which talk about how English is largely an object-orientated language, and whereas actually many indigenous languages are verb-orientated, so they construct a different form of being and becoming in the world. And I think the more conscious we are about these tools and devices that we have to narrate the world and orchestrate and see the world, and the more intentional we become about that, it opens up a landscape of possibility that I think has been largely ignored. And I think this is where I have radical hope.
To expand that landscape of possibility, I understood and agreed with all the words you just said. And then we hang up and I go do my job and this actually is my job, but I go doing the other things on my list, and it's hard to do as an individual. So how critical is it for people to connect and become entangled and have relationships to breathe life into this new way of thinking? How critical is it to have a group of friends or fellow travelers in this space?
Look, I think this space is rooted in constructing new alliances, but also it's rooted in everything around us. The employment contract that we sign, that we write, that is rooted in a theory of I would say, the kind of economic superorganism. It's rooted in a theory of control. So every one of these intentionalities and choices, what biases we default to, is a choice that we have, and we have a choice to change that. I also think that this is why, when I talk about the reanimism of the world, that's an alliance of how we operate in our theory of human contribution to our theory of value, but also non-human contribution, sort of nature and other systems, but also technological contribution. I think there is a new alliance to be made between the technologists and the ecologists and the kind of labor and beyond labor theorists who want to emancipate us from theories and constraints of labor. And I think we have to actively construct these new landscapes of possibilities, and these new politics has to be constructed, because I think there is a new alliance across all those frameworks, and not to live in the landscape of othering. I think you often point this out. We are all a function of the hydrocarbon economy, and we're all living this life as a function of the hydrocarbon economy. And there is no other in that story. And that, I think, requires us to have a different type of political theory in a theory of transition.
Almost all. I learned yesterday there are still many undiscovered, uncontacted tribes in the Amazon, totally. But I get your point. So, what advice do you have, Indy, for young humans who are maybe follow this podcast and suddenly learning about the depth and breadth of the challenges of the human and biosphere predicament? What advice would you give to them?
My genuine advice would be: this is also bloody extraordinary. I think if we leap the Fermi paradox into a new paradigm. And I think this is probably one of the most important and interesting periods of human civilization. And I think there's something extraordinary on the other side of this. And to fall in love with that extraordinariness is as important as to recognize the fear of the predicament where we stand in. And I think we have to live in those two tensions really comfortably. But I think to fall in love is also really important with the potentiality of what exists in front of us.
What do you care most about in the world, Indy?
What I care about most is living with this belief of how extraordinary we can all be. And I don't mean that as a sort of, there's something quite beautiful to live in the world through that lens, as opposed to live with another world. And through my life, there was a very good friend of mine, Paul Cardinal, and I remember something was going on, and I was like, but you don't understand, this guy is amazing. And he is extraordinary in terms of how he cares and manifests in the world. And I remember I was, 12, 13, saying this, and it came out of my mouth, but it was so beautiful for me to look back at it, because that was the thing that I found amazing, is that there is extraordinariness in the world, and to be able to live in that possibility, I think, is really vital.
You follow the podcast, so you know this question is coming. If you could wave a magic wand, Indy Johar, with no personal recourse to your reputation or status, what is one thing you would do to put human and our planetary futures on a better path?
I think I would move us to a verbing language. I don't know what it'd look like. I don't know how we talk. But if English could become a verbing language and would root it in verb orientation, I think we would, and how that would impact code, how that would impact everything else, how we've conceived it. I think there's something really potent in that.
Well, because that loops back to the infrastructure of the past, because we have an infrastructure both in the buildings and the economic institutions, but we have an infrastructure in our language. And that also recursively flips back on who we are or who we perceive that we are.
Precisely.
All right, you've given me an idea for an upcoming Frankly. I'll try to just speak in verbs.
I really appreciate it.
This has been a hell of a first conversation. I can already assure you that I would like to have you as a repeat guest, because I didn't even get to a lot of the questions that we had prepared. If you were to come back, what is one topic that you are passionate about that you know or believe is relevant to the Great Simplification that you would be willing to take a deep dive on?
I think it will be the next economy of land. I think this is probably the base root level transformation that we're in the middle of, and it requires us to reimagine all sorts of logics of ownership, logics of accounting, logic of being relationship, logics of custodianship, all sorts of things. And I think those are going to be rooted in a new thesis and economy of land.
Let's do it. Indy Johar, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you and all the people at Dark Matter Labs for your work. Where can people find out more about what you're working on?
We publish openly all the time on Provocations at Dark Matter Labs. And Nate, I just want to thank you for everything that you're doing in bringing so many amazing people into relationship and into dialogue and to building these conversations into that framework. And I really appreciate it.
Excelsior. Onwards, my friend, to be continued.
Take care.
If you enjoyed or learned from this episode of The Great Simplification, please follow us on your favorite podcast platform. You can also visit thegreatsimplification.com for references and show notes from today's conversation. And to connect with fellow listeners of this podcast, check out our Discord channel. This show is hosted by me, Nate Hagans, edited by No Troublemakers Media, and produced by Misty Stinnett, Leslie Batlutz, Brady Hyen, and Lizzie Siriani.